Well, today I want to continue with our study through the book of James. And we've been focusing specifically on a mini topic or mini series entitled How to Get Through Trials and Tests. Now, you'll remember at the time that James wrote this letter, being a Christian was dangerous to your health, and it could literally cost you your life, and for many it did. So James writes this short little letter to encourage these Jewish Christians, these Hebrew believers, in a crisis, and explains to them the kind of faith that they need. And of course, we need that same faith as well. And he begins with the attitudes that we need to make a part of our lives when we're in tough times. Let me read it to you beginning in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And I want you to keep in mind as I'm reading these verses that he's talking to believers who are in crisis. He says to them, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Now, in that passage I just read you, the key word is the word know. James says, because you know or understand certain things, you're going to have a whole lot better handle on the trials and tests you're going through in your lives. You see, our success in handling the stress and the strain of trials and tests, or any other crisis in our lives for that matter, is going to be determined by what we know or understand. And how you handle that stress will be determined by what you realize to be true. In other words, what you know and what you remember to be true in your life. And the clearer your perspective is, the more stable and the stronger you're going to be when the heat's on in your life. I mean, when the flame is turned up, because it's your perspective on life and on God that will feed your faith in crisis, and it's your faith that will give you the confidence to take on these challenges, these trials and tests, these difficulties that life brings. You see, we need a faith that isn't crushed by the trials and the tests of life. We need a faith that isn't destroyed when life goes upside down or gets sideways. And so when James begins this little book, he gets right to the nitty-gritty of it. And he starts out, as we studied last week, by teaching us 4 truths that we need to know or remember about the trials and the tests we face in life. Remember, he just talked about brothers and sisters, you know. He's saying, here's what you know. And the first thing James says is this: we know that trials and tests are inevitable. They're inevitable. In verse 2, he says, whenever you what? Face trials of many kinds. Notice he doesn't say if troubles happen to maybe come into your life or they maybe will come into your life. No, he says, but when they do come, he says, you will face trials. Count on it. You're going to have trouble. Well, the second thing James says that we need to know and remember and understand is this: trials and tests are variable. And what he simply means by that is they're not all alike. And we know this from personal experience, don't we? I mean, troubles come in all sizes. They come in all shapes. They come in, that 31 different flavors. And notice again, in verse 2, James says, trials of what? Of many kinds. Well, there's a third thing James says that we need to know and remember about trials and tests, and that is, third, they're unpredictable. They're unpredictable. They usually, catch us by surprise. Trials and tests don't warn you in advance that they're coming. They just kind of show up when you least expect it and when you don't want them. And so James says again to us in verse 2, whenever you face trials, whenever they might come or whenever they might happen. And then number 4, James says we need to know and we need to remember that trials and tests are purposeful. They have a purpose. You see, this is really kind of the good news in this whole thing. There's a purpose behind your trials and tests in life. God just doesn't send them into your life haphazardly or allow them to happen for no reason at all. And in verse 3 it says, because you know what? That the testing of your faith produces. You see, trials and tests come to produce something in your life. Now, we're going to talk about that something in a little bit. But what he's saying is that problems and troubles can accomplish something good in your life and mine. The stress and suffering and the things we go through, the difficulties, the hardships, these trials and tests can have value in our lives if we will have what? The right perspective. You see, it's really all about our perspective on these trials and tests that God brings into our lives. It's how we view them, how we look at them. And James is saying that God uses these difficulties for good in our lives. Now, the question is, how in the world can God use trials and tests for something good in our lives? Well, the answer to that is found in verses 3 and 4. And in verses 3 and 4, James gives us 3 purposes of trials and tests in our lives. And so today I want us to examine these 3 purposes of trials and tests and the reasons why God allows us to go through these unwanted and unwelcome trials and tests of life. The first reason is this. Number 1, the first purpose is to test my faith. To test my faith. James says this in verse 3, because you know that the testing of your what? Of your faith. You see, trials come into our lives to test our faith, to test us spiritually. Now, faith is kind of like a muscle, isn't it? And the only way a muscle grows is to have it stretched. You've got to have it strengthened or put pressure on it, to put weight on it. And the way strength in your character or mine grows is by having our faith tested. It has to be stretched. You have to put weight on it like you have to put weight on a muscle. Now, the word testing here is actually the term used for refining metals. And in refining metals, you have to burn off all of the impurity to have a pure metal. So what you do is you take gold or silver and you heat it to extreme temperature where it literally is melted down. And when gold or silver is melted in extreme heat, it burns off all the impurities, and then you're left with pure gold and you're left with pure silver. And right now, the heat may be on in your life because of a crisis or maybe a tragedy or a calamity that you've just recently been through or are presently going through. Or it could be because you've lost your job. Or it could be because of financial difficulties that you're going through. You see, it could be because of any number of things you're experiencing in your life right now. And you've got all kinds of problems as a result of whatever it is that's causing the heat to be turned up in your life. Now, the classic example of when the heat is on and the testing of faith is the story of Job. I mean, his faith was tested in every way you could ever think or imagine. He literally lost everything in life except his wife. And yet at the end, he came out pure, and God restored him with double of what he'd had at the start of his testing and his trial. And sometimes what we think is bad in our lives is God actually preparing us for something good to happen in our lives, that He's going to bring into our lives. Let me say that again. What we think is bad is God actually using that particular experience to prepare us for something good that's about to happen in our lives. Let me illustrate. There's a true story of a man who told how getting laid off was the very best thing that ever happened to him in his entire life. And the story goes like this. He had worked at a sawmill for all of his working career up until that point. And one day during an economic turndown, his boss walked in and abruptly announced that he was fired. He was let go, and he was laid off at 40 years of age. Now that's tough. He had a wife, he had a family, he had no other job opportunities due to the recession. And he told how depressed and fearful he got when that happened. He said, because I've lost my job, I felt like my world had literally caved in the day that I was fired. And he said, I went home and I told my wife what happened, and my wife asked, well, what are you going to do now? I thought about it, and I said, I'm going to do what I've always wanted to do, honey. I'm going to become a builder, and I'm going to mortgage our home, and I'm going into a building business. And he said, my first venture was the construction of 2 small hotels. He said, that's the very first thing I built. But within 5 years, he said, I was a multi-millionaire. That man's name you'll recognize. His name was Wallace Johnson, and the business that he started after getting fired was called Holiday Inns. And he said, today, if I could locate the man who fired me, I would go up and sincerely thank him for what he did. He said, at the time that it happened, I didn't understand why I was fired. Only later could I see that it was God's hand on my life. It was God's unerring and wondrous plan to get me into the career of His choosing. And we often see in hindsight what we can't see in foresight. So the first thing, my friends, that troubles do, the first purpose of trials is they test my faith. And the question is, am I going to trust God in this situation? Well, number 2, the second reason or purpose God allows trials and tests in my life is to develop my endurance. To develop my endurance. Look again at verse 3 with me. He says, you know that the testing of your faith, number 1, does what? It produces perseverance. I like the word for this endurance that trials develop in my life. It's the word perseverance that we read there. It's endurance. Now the question is, just what is perseverance or endurance? Well, the answer is it's staying power. You see, it's literally the ability to handle pressure, the ability to keep hanging on and hanging in there when things go bad, when things go sideways or upside down in our lives. Now, have you ever thought about the question, how do you learn to handle pressure? Really, have you ever thought about this? I mean, how do you learn to handle pressure in your life? Well, there's only one way to learn, and that's by experiencing it. You can only really learn it by experiencing pressure in your life. And this is a quality that's in short supply in our culture right now. Most people give up way too soon. They haven't learned endurance. They haven't learned to persevere. They haven't learned what it means to be steadfast no matter what. And one of the things God wants to teach us when things don't go right is to teach us endurance, perseverance. He wants to test our faith, number 1. He wants to produce endurance or steadfastness or perseverance, secondly, in our lives. I can tell you that when my wife died, I have to admit that I personally went through a period of depression where at times I felt like quitting ministry. Every bone in my body just wanted to give it up. But I had to learn to keep on going. And when you're going through difficult times, what do? You have to keep on going. You have to keep moving ahead with your life. When you're going through heartache, you don't stop there. You don't stay there. And you certainly don't spend the rest of your life there. And when you're going through trials and tests, what do? You just keep walking. You keep putting one foot in front of the other, trudging forward. And it was during this time of depression for me, following Becky's death, that my faith in the Lord and my perspective of His control over my life personally helped me to work through the pain and understand that He has a perfect plan for my life, and that if I'll trust Him, He will work it out according to His perfect will and His perfect plan for me. Well, number 3, James tells us that the third reason or purpose that God allows trials and tests in my life is to mature my character. He says trials and tests mature my character in the process. They test my faith, number 1. They develop endurance or perseverance in my life. And then secondly, they mature my character in that whole process. And this is found in verse 4, where he says this: let perseverance finish its work so that you may be what? Listen, mature and complete, not lacking anything. Wouldn't you like to be that? I mean, a man or a woman of integrity, a man or a woman with no weak spots, a man with character and maturity, a woman with character and maturity. He says that's what happens when you learn to respond to trials and tests in your life correctly. Years ago, there was a fairly famous research study in Russia, and it was on the effect of how different living conditions impact the longevity and the lifespan for different animals. And what happened was that scientists discovered that animals placed in comfortable and easy living conditions actually became weaker and far more susceptible to sickness and would die sooner in their comfortable condition. But those, on the other hand, who were allowed to experience the normal rigors and hardships of life, became far stronger and survived much longer. And I think the same is true of us as human beings. So how does God want us to respond to the trials and tests of life? Well, James chapter 1 gives us those answers too. He gives us 4 very radical, very counterculture responses. And even though they're radical, they're the right response that we should have to trials and tests in our lives. And so in the next message, we're going to look at these 4 ways we should respond to the trials and to the tests in our life. Those difficulties that come our way as we continue our journey in the book of James.